Hello everyone, today we're sitting here with Dram and we're going to talk about some challenges that he came across while developing Silica. Hello Dram.
Hello.
I would like to ask you, why did you decide to use the authentic scale in Silica?
So the authentic scale was chosen to kind of put across the scale of the world. The vehicles being large and so on kind of gives a very interesting feel, one that I really wanted. It was a feel which I recall in seeing in like the images in Dune 2, for example, where you saw that the vehicles were very large relative to the troops, and I wanted to portray that in Silica.
All right. Were there any complication related to the large buildings?
Yes, there was plenty of complications actually. One of them was, for example, building placement. Placement on the terrain, especially because the terrain is not flat. It's of course, very much alive, one could say. Then it was quite complicated to write a system where it would be able to snap to the terrain without having a part of it floating in the air. And the way I solved that was to kind of define points on the building which had to be beneath ground and points which had to be above ground. So if all of the points were like under the ground, that were meant to be under the ground, and the other ones were above the ground, then it was a valid position. Of course, you could move the building up and down to kind of like fit that. And then I had some like entries which had to be clear and so on. But yeah, that was one of the major problems. Some other ones were, for example, recalculating the navigation graph around the building when it was placed. Or when it was destroyed, of course, because of course, the vehicles have to avoid the buildings, troops have to be able to walk on the buildings themselves, and so on. So these are just some of the issues that were encountered with the large buildings.
Mm-hmm. When the buildings are building, there's this kind of like system of, let's say, lights that the people can see in Silica. Can you describe a little bit more of that? Why did you chosen that kind of system?
Mm-hmm. I assume you mean the construction system, which is the fabrication technique, so to speak. So being perfectly honest, the reason I chose that was because it was the most technically feasible for the massive team size. I'm saying that ironically, of course. But basically it was very simple to set up because I had these prefabs which were like square shaped, so I could then just like cover the building and therefore do it so that they progressively appear, cover the whole area where the building will be present, and then pop the building in under that, it wouldn't be visible, and then slowly get rid of that, and then therefore you could see the building like it looks correct, where the building kind of like builds up and then disappears, like the kind of supports. I was inspired a lot by, of course, 3D printing techniques which are current as well.
The world of Silica is physics driven. Can you maybe explain why did you choose that? Like if it was necessary or if it was a good route to go? So
that's a very interesting issue. I remember when I was doing Take on Mars, I was very convinced, and I did a post-mortem on that, presented the other project leads in the company, where I very specifically stated that it's a bad idea to do everything physics driven. Evidently I went back on that, but the reason at the time was mainly because processes were slow and because it adds a ton of issues. But in fact, thanks to the experience I had with Take on Mars, it was actually much more easy for me to go with everything physics driven. Namely, vehicles doing non-physics driven vehicles, like where the actual hull and so on are not actually driven by like Newtonian physics, is a bad idea because it makes it very difficult. You have to snap it to the terrain somehow. So it might look very strange, or it might look unnatural the way the vehicle moves, especially if it goes over a dune. You would expect to kind of like crop over a little bit, and otherwise you'd have to simulate physics to a degree. So therefore I chose to use physics. And I actually had to use convex colliders for the very large vehicles, specifically their tires or their wheels. Because I didn't think about it at the beginning, but when I did choose to use large vehicles, the thing I forgot about is that in a standard vehicle implementation, you would use you'd have a specialized wheel collider, which would have simulation of friction and spinning and all this kind of stuff. And the problem with this is that it's great for vehicles where the tire is smaller than a human. It doesn't work very well for very large vehicles because you can walk under the wheel and so on. And there's a situation where, for example, if you have this kind of a blockage and the vehicle is meant to drive over it, this simulation usually results in a kind of like jump up on top, which would look very incorrect for the harvester, which has gigantic wheels, which need to actually roll over the top of it. So this is something that would be very difficult to achieve with anything other than physics. I mean, you could do it with like, sphere cast and so on, but it would be very complicated and it would just cost about the same performance as running physics on it.
Can you describe a little bit more how you approach the colliders? I know that you mentioned it a little bit, but like, for example, some colliders in the buildings as well and stuff like that.
So the colliders, because it's FPS and RTS, I couldn't take the route of having simplified colliders. Simplified in the sense that, you have, for example, pipes, and you can see through them because they're hollow, but, the collider would just cover the whole thing. Because there is the FPS element, and these pipes are large, so you could theoretically shoot through them, or for example, trusses. There's individual like layers in them, so you have to be able to shoot through them, or like through the areas between the metallic parts, because it's just what a player would expect in an FPS. And if it just bounced off the side of it, that would look very strange and be very unpleasant, because you wouldn't fulfill the expectations of the players of the world from an FPS perspective. And quite frankly, it's also very interesting to have these accurate colliders and things bounce where they're meant to and so on. And because there is realistic ballistics, there is ricochets, or there are ricochets for the projectiles, there is penetration and so on as well. So, it's very important to have realistic colliders for this reason.
Were there some other challenges maybe connected with it, like while implementing that?
Yes, one of the challenges is like having complex colliders makes it, or more specifically, the more complex the colliders are, the bigger the problem is, for example, to update the nav mesh. It just takes longer because it has to voxelize the actual collider and so on. And so when it has to voxelize the collider, that takes much more time than if it was just a simple box, for example. So these are the challenges where you have to make complex colliders, but not too complex, because then it runs into performance issues. For example, for the nav mesh regeneration, not on recalculation, sorry. Not only that, but of course, the more complex the colliders are, then, for example, the crabs walking on them will just take up more performance, because there's much more physics calculations going into actually calculating the movement or the collisions on the collider. So yeah, there are like these kind of issues mainly.
Going back to the realistic ballistics as well, and the ricochet and stuff like that, you can very well see it when you slow down the time. Can you maybe explain a little bit like how can that result, why people are like shooting, in a fast pace, let's say game or fast paced action? How does that like influence the actual game? Like, they can see some example.
So you can see it, for example, when tanks are fighting against each other, especially at range. You shoot at a tank and it tends to, let's say, of course not the railgun tank, that has a different type of shell, but for standard shells, it'll bounce off the top of the armor, and you'll see that kind of that metallic kind of like the sparks and so on, and you're like, I didn't hit it correctly. It influences gameplay quite heavily, because it means that there's the tactics you would expect, for example, in War Thunder for the tanks, for example. So there's tactics with angling the tank, so you have the flat sides of the armor, towards the enemy, not presenting a flat side which can be penetrated correctly, relatively easily. Because if it's, of course, directly, then the shell is going to penetrate and do much more damage than if it was at an angle where it would, for example, either ricochet or it would explode on the surface. Still do a little bit of damage, but not enough to like take out the tank. And there are of course weak points. So under the turret, for example, there's the neck, you could say. If you hit that does a lot of damage, and so on. So yeah, there's these kind of tactics which come into play with the realistic ballistics.
Cool. And with ricochets, for example, can it hit some of the target?
Yeah, of course it can. As soon as it ricochets, there's also simulation on whether the projectile is deformed. So a tank shell, if it gets deformed from the ricochet, because it can be a very slight ricochet, in which case it does not get deformed. And what you might get is, for example, if you have a front part of the armor and over here you have the turret and there's the neck, you can kind of like ricochet it very slightly up into the neck off the front of the tank. It's a very, very long shot, let's say, but it can happen. It has happened to me multiple times. Against me, of course, it never happens to me. But anyway, but yes, this does play a role. In the sense that if the bullet bounces, or the shell, for example, does bounce at too strong an angle, it will start spinning. It does go into like a proper spinning. The spin of the projectile is also simulated. So it will kind of like get into this kind of like spiral off, and it can hit someone and still do impact damage, but it won't explode because it's been deformed and it just can't explode anymore.
That's very interesting because like people are playing, they can experience these like strange scenarios, but it's good to know that they're actually like quite realistic. Going back to the aliens, you mentioned that like while they're climbing the gliders and stuff like that, they can also climb each other and form these kind of like big swarms. Can you share a little bit like why did you decide that they can do that, and how is that done, let's say, in the engine or like...
So the thing with the aliens and being able to swarm, this was one thing why going with physics was a good idea. Because doing this with anything but physics just makes it very complicated to do. Because you'd have to do sphere casts, and then you have to kind of like go and you basically simulate physics. So there's no real point to it. The way the actual the aliens work, they actually have a sphere collider, which there's no raycast or anything like that apart from footsteps, because I have to, of course, detect the footsteps. But other than that, they actually just literally are a ball moving on the terrain and reacting to the terrain. So when it bumps into something, especially on the ground, for example, you know, it gets the normal of that, and it knows which direction is up, you could say. So if there's a point beneath and a point like this where it runs into a wall, then when it runs into the wall, it knows that, you know, the input that I'm giving it is forward into the wall. So logically, this is the more important direction than this one. So therefore, it starts to angle up, and then it goes up the wall. And the important thing is, yes, they can climb over each other, but they can't climb onto each other just by themselves. It would have to be like that. There's more of them, and then they get kind of like pushed, but they can climb over the top. I've got simulation of, I've got limitations to the movement, because before what was happening, they could literally climb on top of each other, which was really fun. But what would happen is two crabs would climb on top of each other, and then they just kind of go into a spiral and they'd have a basically alien space program. But what I've done here is I've limited it so they can't climb on top of each other, but they can only go, if it's relative to gravity, I think within, 10, 15 degrees or something like that. I forget exactly. But so if they're on top of each other, they can climb on top of each other, but they can't climb up onto each other. And therefore, when there's a lot of them, they just naturally push each other on top, and it creates this big pile, which looks really good, of course. But yeah, it's one big advantage of using physics for this.
Since you're mentioning that they can kind of like push up, the community knows that there's going to be air units. Does that have some advantage, let's say, against the air units?
It does, technically speaking, because everything is running on physics, then the crab, if it catches onto an air vehicle, it naturally applies, a downforce because of its weight. So if there's, let's say, 3 crabs that jump onto a very light air vehicle, they will pull it down to the ground. I think I've shown that I've shown it in multiple kind of like online streams with, for example, the Dead Wizard or Lycan and so on. And in these streams, I showed it where I spawned a ton of them, let's say 300 of them. And I had a flying air vehicle, and they kind of tried to attack that, and they would just kind of like jump up here and there. Then one would catch on, and then a second one would catch on, and then they pull it down into the big pile, and then it's gone, of course. It kind of like disappears into the pile. But yeah, they do apply correct weight and so on. That's the advantage of the physics in this regard. And so it is usable against the air units, but I mean, quite frankly, if your air units are sitting on the ground, you're doing something wrong. But they should be able to land, especially so players can take them. Not only that, but also so they can hide. If they're in the air, they're an easier target, of course. That said, I will mention one last thing, and the plan is so that aliens actually get the first air units. Simple, like not very powerful, but the advantage of that would be that once the humans get air units, these ones could swarm that air unit and in fact drag it down to the ground, because they'll land on top of it and it'll fall to the ground, for example. But we'll see how that goes. I'm still implementing it, so.
Yeah, I think this is gonna bring some very good action in all the buttons. Cool. Can you tell us a little bit more about the multiplayer synchronization? How is that approached? Why did you choose that approach, and how does it work?
I went against the standard tactic of using, for example, replication, or you could call it that, which is that it's all entirely server-side. The reason for this is because you just send differences in the world. The reason is because it's a lot of data, and once there's a huge amount of units, then that causes a problem in synchronization. It requires a lot of data to synchronize, and it means you do have to synchronize at a very large tick rate. So for example, with Counter-Strike, you're getting 120 Hz servers. where in Silica it's 5 hertz. It only synchronizes 5 times per second. You know, so it's a massive difference in the approach for synchronization. The advantage of that, and the reason for that I think is more important, is because I went with client-hosted service. You know, listen server. So I can host a game and I can play with my friends. They can join my server. And if it required a really strong connection, like a really powerful, like really large bandwidth for that, then it would really limit who can actually start a server. Or it would really limit how much units they can have in the server. So my goal was always to go with around 100 to 200 units maximum in the game. I did not put a unit cap in, and so it resulted in, of course, everyone spawning about 500 to 600, you know, even more. So I have been working on optimizing that in terms of performance, but I will also be working on optimizing that in terms of bandwidth. Because right now when there's 600 units, it's a lot of data that has to be sent. You know, but I think that kind of like speaks for itself. You know, that you can basically synchronize 600 units over the net. You know, it is a lot to synchronize, especially when they're all in one group. You know, you have to be able to kind of handle 600 units, for example, 600 units, if that's the amount you can build. You know, of course with error correction and so on, right? But the main reason was I wanted to limit how much bandwidth is required for it. Especially because I've gone with physics for everything. It means that everything does have to synchronize linear velocity, so just like, you know, positional or directional velocity, and then angular velocity as well. That's 2 vectors. That's already quite a lot of data. And then plus position and rotation. You know, the rotation, you can kind of like break the quaternion down into just 4 bytes, for example. But nonetheless, you still have to synchronize that. So it's a lot of data and per unit, you know, and you really can't reduce that all that much without impacting the individual unit. So for example, with the swarm, yeah, that could work. You can kind of like limit that down and kind of like, you know, recalculate it, so to speak. But you know, if it's an individual unit, you will notice that it's causing problems. So yeah, mainly that, just the amount of units really made me limit how much that gets is to be synchronized. And a more important point, and this is a more of a funny one actually, I wanted to support really high ping rates. Right, so my brother lives, I was born in the Czech Republic, grew up in Australia. My brother is still in Australia, I'm here in the Czech Republic. And you know, I like to play the game with him. And whenever we play anything, there's a 300 millisecond ping. So it makes it extremely impractical to play anything with him online. And so I wanted to support this kind of a high ping rate, like high ping, so to speak. And so this system allows for that, because I did do client-side hit detection, but so the approach is in fact old school, you could say. And of course, the old school thing which you have to do to that is sanity checks, because I've noticed now there's a lot of hackers which have been showing up, you know, where they've of course, you know, decompiled the game and they found out how the packets are built and so on, and so they send it much faster than they should. So I need to do sanity checks. Oh, you're sending much more damage packets than you should be. Oh, you're moving faster than you should be, and so on, and auto ban them.
The big challenge also was the fog of war for FPS and RTS. How did you approach that, and why did you choose that approach that is in the game?
So, from a standard RTS, one would expect, of course, fog of war. Whatever's in the fog of, whatever's outside of the vision, active vision, or units specifically that are outside of the vision range in the fog of war would be concealed, right? They would just not be visible. That of course causes problems with FPS, where it's just, you know, line of sight essentially, right? And at the same time, I couldn't use line of sight for RTS, because if you have a cliff face, because I have, you know, really plastic terrain, really 3D terrain, then if you have, for example, a cliff face and you have a crab on top, then his line of sight ends on the edge of the cliff. And if you have a unit down here, it's revealed by the fog of war. It should be revealed by the fog of war, but you have no line of sight. So, you know, I would expect as an FPS player that, or as an FPS player, I would expect not to see it to a degree. But from an RTS perspective, I would most certainly expect to see it. So I kind of went with this was the only kind of, this is the only point where I kind of had to do kind of like, you know, the best of both worlds. So I added in a thing which I call concealment, right? So there's the vision range of the fog of war, and anything within that, like out in the open, is revealed. So under the cliff, if it's not directly near the cliff, but it's somewhere here, and there's a unit here, it will be revealed. but units can be concealed if they're near, for example, large rocks, cliffs, and so on. And of course, it depends. It changes from unit to unit. So you cannot hide, for example, a hover tank which is actively hovering because its thrusters are very clearly visible. And so there's multiple ways a unit can be detected via audio. So if it's just standing on the spot with just idle engine, let's say a light quad, then it's not going to be heard from a distance. If it starts shooting, it's going to be much more audible. So just the audible range can reveal a unit. But let's go with just soldiers, for example, because those are much more, they're very small relative to everything else, and they can be hidden quite well. So they might be near a cliff. If a crab is on top, he can't see the soldier, which is hiding near the cliff. That soldier is considered concealed, and even though the fog of war clearly should kind of reveal him, I wouldn't expect, from an RTS perspective, if I have my crab here and he's not directly looking at the soldier, I would not expect to see a soldier hiding in the cliff there. So, but as soon as the crab goes over the cliff and starts walking down it and has a direct line of sight, then it does get revealed. And there's of course a visibility algorithm. So if the soldier's staying put, not moving, then it's going to be much harder to kind of detect him there, rather than if the soldier started running around shooting and so on. So and that applies to outside of the vision range within the fog of war. So if I have, again, that same crab on top of the cliff, and I have a tank outside of that range, which is, let's say the view range is about here, I have a tank just over here, then that crab might have a direct line of sight and will therefore detect that tank, despite it being outside of the fog of war. And of course, it gets multiplied when he starts shooting and so on. So that's the kind of compromise I went with, and it works quite well. I mean, I haven't had any feedback indicating that it was strange that something got detected or anything like that. There have been situations where, for example, a building got detected across the map. This is just a bug which I need to fix.
I really like this approach, to be fair, personally, so I think it works really well, and since nobody's complaining, then I think that I'm happy with it as well. There must have been a lot of gameplay challenges as well. Could you walk us through a couple of them and kind of also explain?
One of the gameplay challenges was, especially at the beginning of the game, and that is still a challenge, to be perfectly fair. When the game starts, specifically I'm talking about strategy mode, of course. When the game starts, especially on the really large map. So the normal size map is 3 by 3 kilometers, while the larger ones are 6 by 6. And especially on those, if the two teams start at opposite ends, then there's a lot of ground to cover. And before, when you were just running around as a soldier, it could be frustrating getting across that kind of a distance, especially when, for example, you would go, you get in a car and so on, you'd go get into combat, and then you die. You respawn at base. And at that point, you'd have to make your way back. And if there was no vehicle around, you'd have to go on foot or just wait. And that was what was happening. And so I introduced, it's part of the lore as well, is teleportation. Right? In fact, the idea is that teleportation enabled this whole war in the first place, right? It enabled people to get to Baltarus. But lore aside, in the game, I introduced teleportation for the humans. Now, teleportation, it has limits, and I still have to kind of go and probably add more limits because it can get abused and so on. But the idea is that you can teleport as long as your other units can see there. You can teleport there. That's the current state. That might change in the future depending on feedback and so on. But the further away you are from the source, the greater the uncertainty radius. This is part of the lore. And so when you teleport there, you might say, let's say you teleport 1 kilometer. Then you would have an uncertainty radius of about 1/10 of that distance, which is 100 meters. And therefore, that can put you off from your, where you say, I want to teleport here, right next to this rocket launcher, which I want to jump into. And you'd get teleport 100 meters away from that. And of course, that means you have to get to it. But 100 meters is no problem. It is a problem if you're under fire. So that's the idea of it, right? That was one of the gameplay challenges. And of course, unit count or being able to kind of make a difference as an FPS player. That's been one contentious issue. It's how can I make a difference as an FPS player? I mean, if you're a scout with an SMG and you're in late game, you're not going to make much of a difference, quite frankly, unless you get in a vehicle. But that's the whole idea. You select a loadout, you select a much heavier loadout, and then you can sure as hell make a difference. So, and of course, jumping in the vehicles, a player will always be better than the AI.
There's also day and night cycle. Can you also explain like what perks does it bring and basically why you also decided to go with that?
I went with the day and night cycle mainly because it just felt natural. And I was playing around and I didn't want to just limit it to, basically because I was doing the locations, I didn't want to do baked lighting because they're so huge. Doing baked lighting would be insane. So I decided to put in a day-night cycle because it just felt natural. And also because I wanted to have a certain advantage for aliens during the night. So that humans have advantage in the day, aliens have an advantage in the night. And that was what I wanted to go with, and that's why I decided to put in the day-night cycle. I actually did it so that the day makes up about, what, 60 or 70% of the time, and then night takes up only 30 to 40%. I forget exactly right now. But basically night is accelerated. And the idea is because everyone was complaining that the night took too long. And it is a bit more, like, yeah, sure, you have night vision and so on, but it is just more interesting during the day. But the nighttime kind of makes it more interesting for the aliens because they kind of like can see further, they can hide better in the shadows and so on, whereas the humans cannot. And so, or specifically the vehicles cannot, the humans of course can. So yeah, mainly that was why. Gameplay and of course effect. You know, that feeling when you got the sun rising in the distance, and it also, you get a feeling of time passing. You know, you kind of do get that. For some reason, it's very satisfying when there's a big battle happening against you, right? Or if you're fighting for the enemy, then that feeling of, oh, we're going into the second day, you know, that you're fighting, it goes from day into nighttime, you're still fighting, and then, you know, you push off the enemy and the sun starts rising. It's like, oh, survive that one day, survive till morning. So it adds that kind of like goal, all right, you know, nighttime is coming, and whatever. And another thing which it also influences is, you know, the sun in the background. If you attack with the sun to your back, it's going to be much harder for the players going the opposite direction to be able to attack you because it's difficult to see against the sun. The sun is very strong intentionally. It's a gameplay thing. I might tweak it just a little bit, so it's not that strong. But the idea is that it should play a role in the game itself. You know, going against the sun, especially on Baltarus, which is meant to be scorched by the sun, you know, it's meant to be over 100 degrees Celsius on the surface of the planet, then that's the idea, that it's meant to be hot.
Does it also break some downsides, maybe like to, I don't know, performance or even just like into gameplay? You mentioned it a little bit, but you can have also.
In terms of performance, you know, real-time dynamic lighting is always a little bit more expensive than static baked lighting. But again, like I mentioned, here it was just a problem to do proper baked lighting because of the size of the locations. That's one thing, and the second thing is also was just because I couldn't do baked lighting properly. You can do it to a degree, but I just wanted to kind of avoid it for various reasons, and it just felt more natural, quite frankly. You know, the sun staying in the sky constantly at the same location is a little bit boring, you know, and it was one of the kind of like unique factors with this, where I really like, for example, in Warcraft 3. You know, that feeling when you're fighting in the day and then suddenly, you know, you'd hear the woo, you know, it would go into the nighttime. Then it was a lot of fun. You felt progression in the world, and I wanted to kind of like replicate that feel. But it was actually not that difficult to put in. I mean, literally, I had a day-night cycle done in like 2 or 3 days. But then it was mainly about tweaking the lighting, you know, because I did do realistic darkness. Just literally by the brightness levels, and it was just too dark, so I had to kind of like boost it. And it's like, oh, you know, it looks a bit strange if you have a moon like ours, and you know, and it casts a massively bright light. So I decided to kind of like make, okay, it's an ice moon because our moon has a very low albedo. It's very dark. If you literally saw Earth and the moon next to each other, it's not white. It's very dark. It's more like ash. So I decided to go with an ice moon, right, which is much brighter, has a much higher albedo, and therefore reflects much more light, and therefore makes much more sense that it's very bright during the night. So that's the way I solved it.
That's quite perfect, actually. That makes a lot of sense. Were there some challenges connected with ammunition, and basically why you decided also to go with what's in the game?
Ammunition is a good point. I wanted to differentiate it, like, because I like realism, but I didn't want to go overboard because then it just becomes a mod of armor, you could say. And then it would make more sense to do it as a mod of armor. Here I wanted to kind of like reduce what was needed for logistics, for example. Because if you add ammunition, add limited fuel, then the vehicle, a vehicle driving to the enemy and, oh, sorry man, I'm running out of fuel, you're gonna have to send me back to base, or you're gonna have to bring some canisters to refill. Or ammunition, same thing. All right, you run out of ammunition in the vehicle, what, and they have to return to base to resupply, and it could be 6 kilometers in the worst case. So it was kind of a natural choice to avoid limited ammunition to a degree, but also, and this was more important for me, it was the thing you see in armor, because it's realistic, and this makes sense, that's armor, right, is people shooting at each other from range. You're just not going to send random shots down range. You're going to be much more precise, because you have to be careful. Weapons are very precise, of course, and limited ammunition, so you just can't go and like fill the forest with lead, so to speak. You're going to watch, oh, there's an enemy, send bullets down that way. Here, because I want to kind of like more oriented towards action and get an authentic feeling while not going overboard with realism, I decided to not have infinite ammunition for this, one of the main reasons. And therefore, what happens is, if I'm, for example, flying around with a vehicle, right? And I know I'm talking about flying vehicles of all things, or just driving around with a tank to make it more current. I'm driving around with the tank and I see an enemy. I think I see an enemy. I'm not sure. I haven't detected him properly. So if I look on the map, he hasn't been detected. But I think I saw something there. I'm just gonna, oh crap, I'll just shoot something in that direction because I'm not sure. And for the other person, because there's bullets flying his way, it's like, oh crap. It kind of adds that stress factor, but makes it more fun for both sides. It's fun to shoot and it's fun to be shot at. Because if it's too realistic in terms of the precision, which I would expect in 2351, if we had World War II levels of precision, that would be quite pathetic, right? But this kind of fits into the lore to a degree, because people were actually meant to have like disabled or dismantled all armies and stuff, because they were peaceful. They invented teleportation in 2351. And then colonized, Proxima Centauri, or a planet near Proxima Centauri, called Centaurus, because of the constellation. And so there was no need for war at the time, because people were just working together. Then they discovered Baltarus, and then of course they discovered Balterium, and people can be greedy, and therefore suddenly, or more specifically, the aliens attacked humans there, and suddenly you need weapons. And everything was dismantled. There was no need for an army, military, and whatever. And suddenly you get to the point, okay, we have to reestablish an arm of the military. So you kind of take the weapons which you had previously, and you kind of reestablish, retrain, and so on. That was the idea behind this as well, to kind of like fit into that. But mainly it was more about the gameplay. I wanted a lot of projectiles to be flying down range. I didn't want to have it so there's like nothing, bang, a guy dies, because it's not as fun for the scale, it's not exactly difficult to hit a gigantic harvester with a machine gun, because you're not going to miss. If you miss, you stop playing it, but like with a machine gun, of course. But that's the thing, it just felt much more fun, in my opinion, shooting at someone at range with, especially when they shoot at you as well. You kind of get that, oh shit, you got to hide somewhere. That kind of feeling, rather than just, oh, then you're dead.
Were there some other challenges connected with the commander versus infantry, let's say?
That's a good point. Commander versus infantry. So, of course, from an infantry perspective, standard FPS, or standard FPS controls more specifically. You can select your loadout, you can jump into vehicles and so on. But communication, I think that would be the most important thing. Right now I've got just chat, and eventually I have to add voice over IP, that is planned, of course, as well as pinging. That's sorely missing right now, quite frankly. But apart from that, from the commander's perspective, the commander, of course, should also be able to ping, as well as talk over the microphone as well. But giving orders to units, the way I decided to go is that players, from the perspective of a commander, are just the same as any other unit in the way that you command them, right? So you select a human player, you select another soldier, it's the same thing, and you give them an order. What to do, where to move, what to attack, and so on. And the players see that as, commander's orders, do this. So in this regard, it's very fluid in the way you command everything from the commander's perspective, because otherwise, if there was a completely different system, it would be quite frustrating. So it was a kind of natural outcome of combining the two together. But communication still has to be worked on. There has to be, like I mentioned, I still have to add in voice over IP and pinging for both commander and for infantry.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, we're looking forward to that. That's going to be nice. And my last question would be, what challenges brought the AI to the AI commander? Like, were there such challenges connected with that, with like AI specifically for the commander?
So doing a AI commander is, there are a lot of challenges. The main thing is I didn't want to use behavior trees for this because you're limited to what's in the behavior tree. I decided to go with more of a priority-based system where it evaluates the battlefield. Evaluates, all right, there's some enemy units over here, and groups them, of course, so it's not one individual one. Enemy buildings over there, and so on. I have, those Baltarian fields or potential positions for Baltarian fields, potential positions for bunkers, and so on. And it just creates a list based on distance, how important whatever it is. So, for example, if I only know of one Baltarian field, then finding another Baltarian field, is a higher priority. So logically, I would put that into the queue with a higher priority, and therefore, then I go at the end of the getting all of these the situation reports, you could say. I then go and evaluate them starting with the highest priority and going downwards. So the biggest problem with this is that this system starts working only once you have everything done. Because otherwise, soldiers will get ordered to attack. Oh, attack the base, attack those units, attack those. But if you don't have defense written, then all of your soldiers just disappear in attacking and no one stays to defend. That's one of the problems, in fact, what happens now to a degree. So I still have to finish, of course, defense and so on. But this is one of the problems with the solution I've chosen. There are, of course, different solutions. One of the best solutions would be to go with machine learning, but that's not exactly an easy thing to do. One, two, it would require a large amount of data, especially for per location and so on, that it would just become insane, and plus it would eat a lot of performance and so on. So there was no need to do that, at least not for now. And so I kind of went with this priority-based system, which is relatively easy to evaluate.
All right, thank you very much. I think that concludes the interview. I would probably like to say that it was based on the talk that you had over Game Access. And you also won there the editorial awards.
Yes, that was very nice from Vision Game.
So that was very, very nice. It was a very nice event. So thank you for the talk today. And
thank you.
You guys can check Silica on Steam definitely, and you can join our Discord where Dram is also present and answering questions. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Take care, guys. Enjoy.